So, as Nicole said, I'm going to be talking about air-breathing fishes and why they're way cool. Well, air-breathing fishes are much different than what we normally think of a typical fish. So, here we have a trout, lives in water, breathes water, just does normal fishy things. However, air-breathing fishes are much different than this trout. Here we have a mangrove killifish, which is found in Southeast Asia. And this fish is an air breather, actually likes to spend time out of water. This one's actually just hanging out in an empty log. So it's much, much different than what you normally think of a typical fish. So air-breathing fishes are incredibly diverse. And it's not just one type of fish or one group of fish that live in the same place. It's actually many different groups and many, many different species of fishes. And just to introduce you to a couple, air-breathing fishes actually include some of the largest freshwater fish in the world. Now you may not have heard these ones before, but this is Arapaima. It's found in the Brazilian Amazon, and it can get up to 4.5 meters long and 200 kilos. That's incredibly big, or 15 feet and 440 pounds. And another one that's a little bit closer to here, found in southern United States, is the alligator gar. So again, it can get up to about 2.5 meters and 150 kilos, a massive fish. So air-breathing fishes are actually only a relatively small number of the total groups of total fish. So there's about 65,000 vertebrate species in total, so a lot of vertebrate species. And amazingly, half of these are fish. Air-breathing fishes, however, are only about 1.5% of the total fish species. So depending on who's doing the count, you get 400, 450 fishes. So if you would think all these fish in this water, one of these would be an air-breathing fish. So they're actually not really that many proportionally. But I'm going to try to introduce you guys to a couple, or 5 different species in a bit more detail. Some that you may have heard of and just not realize that they're an air-breathing fish, or maybe you've never heard them at all. So here we have a mudskipper. And this guy's pretty cool because they actually use their pectoral fins to walk around on land. They actually like to spend time on land. So sometimes some of these species, actually a number of mudskipper species, but some of them, if you put them in water, they'll actually go back on land. They like to spend time on land. You know, they're quite amphibious, so they're more like an amphibian, like a frog or a salamander in that regard. But they're actually related to gobies, which are very common aquarium fish that are water-breathing group of fishes. And these guys are found in the intertidal habitats in mangroves, often in mangroves, so quite often in areas in red here and yellow. So Southeast Asia, Australia, parts of Africa, and India. These are kind of neat because they actually make burrows in these mud flats. So here we got a mudskipper, and in these mud flats, they can actually dig out holes and create these burrows where they can hide from predators and deposit eggs. And another really neat thing is that they'll actually take air from the surface, gulp it, and release it into these burrows here to create a bit of an airspace so that they can breathe. So the next one I'm going to show you is the electric eel. So who's heard of an electric eel before? Yeah? Okay. You guys know that they're pretty, can be pretty dangerous. They produce these electric currents using these electric organs. These electric organs are called electrocytes. And they're basically a series of cells that act like a battery. Now these cells can produce a current of about 600 volts when released. So this is about 5 times the strength of, if I were to stick my finger in an electrical plug, it would be 5 times that shock. So that kind of shock could actually knock a horse off its feet. That's pretty powerful. And it could probably even like kill an older person or a younger person or somebody with a heart problem. One of the professors at here at UBC, well, he's a maritime, but when he was working in the Brazilian Amazon in the 70s, he actually got shocked when they were on the boat. They were working with these animals, and he brought them up, and I guess I don't know what he was doing, but he somehow got zapped by one of these things, and apparently it was pretty scary for him. It was just out in the middle of the Amazon River, and he gets zapped. So it's pretty scary. These guys aren't actually a true eel. They're more related to carp, so they just have an eel-like body. And they're so dependent on air breathing that they will actually drown. So just like if you or I were to go swimming and get at the bottom and don't come up for air, we'll drown. These guys are the same way, so they need to breathe air. So as mentioned, they're found in the Amazon River basin in South America, primarily in Brazil. And the next fish I'm going to introduce you to is the South American lungfish, again from South America. And this one's kind of neat because when the first biologists were going up the rivers, they found this creature. And they couldn't figure out if it was a fish, if it was an amphibian. It kind of acted like a bit of an amphibian. It moved on land, it was breathing air, but then it had many characteristics of a fish. And so it basically presented a paradox. What do we call it? Well, they ended up naming it Leptosiren paradoxa, because they just didn't know at the time. But we do know now that it is a fish. It shares more characteristics with fish than amphibian. But interestingly, lungfishes are actually more closely related to tetrapods. So like amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds than other fishes. And one of the things that we know that from their limbs. Their limbs are actually, although they're much more rudimentary than our arms and legs, they actually share a lot of the similar characteristics that we have. And this allows them to kind of basically walk, where they can use their limbs to push themselves on water. Again, they're found in South America. The range actually extends a bit more in southern Brazil into the swamps and the Pantanal. So this little clip shows you these lungfish in this aquarium kind of walking along the bottom of the tank. So its limbs are incredibly weak, though. They don't have developed muscles or anything like that. You can see the front two limbs, and then there's two rear limbs. It kind of uses to kind of walk along the bottom. So it's pretty neat. So the next one is the snakehead. And I'm sure some of you guys have heard about the snakehead, especially if you live in Burnaby, Burnaby Lake, something like that. So snakeheads are a very good example of a very successful air-breathing fish. And they're very successful, and they're also very invasive. So these guys are actually very detrimental to ecosystems where they're not native to. And so anybody can recall a couple years ago, they were talking about these Fishzilla, the Frankenfish terrorizing the people of British Columbia. So somebody made a very poor decision and decided to take the snakehead from his tank, presumably because it got too big, and put it in Burnaby Lake, and they'll give it a nice home. Well, it's not a very good idea, because this fish can basically devour everything and anything that its mouth will fit in its mouth. And it can actually make its way across land to other water bodies. So imagine maybe the fish leaving Burnaby Lake and entering the Fraser River system. That'd be pretty bad. These guys can produce copious amounts of egg, reproduce very quickly, and if they can eat everything and anything, that's going to decimate the salmon populations and other trout. It would be really bad for British Columbia. And in fact, they've actually spread across the United States quite a bit. All these little circles are either sited or established population. So quite often, especially for the Asian food market, people will produce them in aquaculture ponds, and often, sometimes they escape and they enter local waterways and they end up reproducing. And this little quote says, entire waterways have been taken over in the southern United States and the local species decimated. And this individual is saying, it actually takes small animals. And if you had a chihuahua or a small dog, you didn't know if you wanted it in the vicinity of this fish. Imagine walking your little dog and, okay, I'll have a little drink, and the snakehead comes up and eats it. I'm sure that probably doesn't actually happen, but the northern variety can actually get about 1.5 meters in length. So that's bigger than a small child. So never been any reports of snakeheads actually eating or attacking people like that. But kind of makes you realize that maybe these guys are a little bit dangerous. So the next fish is actually the one that I had, same species that I had on the first slide. This is the betta fish, also commonly referred to as the Siamese fighting fish, because if you have two males in the same tank, they will actually compete with each other in a fight, and potentially one will kill the other. So these fish are actually very common in aquarium stores or pet stores. They usually sell them in like little tiny glasses and probably like, I don't know, barely any water, probably just as much water as there is fish in some of these, and sell them for like $5 or $6. But they're incredibly beautiful. They have many different colorations. And the other really, I think, neat thing about them is that they're incredibly easy to care for. Although a lot of people neglect them, they're actually, they don't need a lot of care in a sense because they are air breathers, and they're actually just very, very tough fish, which makes them really easy to keep. These fish are actually native to Southeast Asia, the Mekong River Basin, which includes Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. And they're found in the, like the canals, the transportation canals, rice paddies, and other flooded fields around there. So betta fish have a unique behavior that's kind of cool, that's related to their air-breathing ability, and it's that males can build bubble nests. So males take out air and release it into these nests by taking the mucus, the saliva mucus secretion, and can form these nice little bubbles and create these nests. And so the males exhibit parental care, which is actually fairly unique amongst fish, and gives the offspring a higher rate of survival. So I showed you like 5 different species, and they're all very quite different, but they do have the one thing in common, which I'm sure you mentioned, is breathe air. But how do they breathe air? How does a fish normally breathe? Anybody have any idea how a fish normally breathes? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, so they take up oxygen from the water across the gill. So in most water-breathing fish, water enters the mouth and crosses the gill, so the gill covering is the operculum. And so as water flows through, it'll flow through the gill filaments, which will make up the gills. And in the gill filaments, there are blood vessels. And so as the blood goes through the gill filaments, water passes over, and they take up oxygen. So from there, oxygen is transported to the tissues. So enters the gills, goes to the tissues, taken up, and when we take up oxygen, we end up releasing a byproduct, which is carbon dioxide or CO2. So CO2 is given off from the tissues and released across the gill into the water. But these are not the fish that we're focusing in on today. Focusing in on air-breathing fish, which are a lot more extraordinary. And you can see this South American lungfish. I think it just came up for a breath of air. But another one up there. Oh, there you go. So we release some bubbles. So it's like, basically if you or I would take a breath of air, go underwater, and exhale, we would have bubbles coming up. So that's pretty neat. But also leads to the question, why do these fish breathe air? I mean, only 1.5% of all fish breathe air. Most fish seem to do pretty good with water. While many aquatic environments are actually quite low in oxygen, so they experience hypoxia, which is basically low oxygen, so low oxygen. So here I have a couple of different pictures of various aquatic environments. So some of these are very normal in oxygen levels or relatively high, and some of these are very low. So these ones that are relatively high in oxygen do not have any vegetation on the surface. They have water turnover, water mixing. They're generally cooler environments, so they're much a little bit colder, more like what we'd see around in British Columbia. Where environments that are low in oxygen typically have very slow water turnover. There's lots of vegetation. Like you can see, this is from Brazil, these like giant lily pads floating on the surface. So you see that there's very big differences between these two types of environments. Furthermore, oxygen levels can fluctuate throughout the day. So here's oxygen levels, so 100%, dashed line. And oxygen levels, depending on the time of the day, can vary. And they can also vary throughout the season, throughout the year. Now this can be a bit of a problem for water-breathing fishes. So here we have a couple of salmon migrating upstream. And water-breathing fishes do have problems with low oxygen. If you guys have paid attention to the news this summer, you realize that there was a big concern over the salmon population dying off. And a lot of this part of this had to do with because of increase in temperatures lead to reduced oxygen level in the water. So this basically means that sometimes there's just not enough oxygen for these water-breathing fishes. So there's a whole bunch of news articles talking about increased temperatures related to low oxygen, and how it's going to lead to poor returns on the salmon run. In California, there was an increase in temperature that led to severely low oxygen levels in a hatchery that killed 155,000 trout. In Alberta, the trout were struggling to breathe in the warm waters, and which very low oxygen waters. And so, unfortunately, these fish kills due to low oxygen are quite common. Fortunately, not so much in British Columbia, but in various parts of the world where you have more variability in oxygen levels. So here we have this, I'm not actually sure where this is, but it's basically an example of a severe fish die-off due to low oxygen. Fortunately, air-breathing fishes have found a way around this problem. So here we have a gar, which is a species of well, it's actually 7 different species of air-breathing fish. This is the long-nosed gar, found in the United States. And these guys are able to breathe air. So air is basically a source of unlimited oxygen. So air is composed of about 21% oxygen, with most of the rest being nitrogen. And oxygen is incredibly more soluble in air. So oxygen is about 35 times more soluble than in water. And fortunately for us, oxygen levels do not fluctuate. So if we need a breath of air, we take a breath of air. It doesn't matter the time of day, it doesn't matter the time of year. We just breathe and it comes in. So that's what these guys can take advantage of. So I'll just remind you that water-breathing fishes take up oxygen and release CO2 across the gills. But air-breathing fishes, they take up oxygen at the air-breathing organ, or ABO for short. So they take it up, and I'll show you a couple of examples of air-breathing organs in a minute. And then take it up at the ABO, goes to the tissues, but they still release CO2 at the gills. And I will explain why that is in a few minutes. But first of all, what is an air-breathing organ? And are they the same in all air-breathing fishes? Well, air breathing has evolved over 70 times in fishes. So unlike for tetrapods, where air breathing has only evolved once and we all have lungs, air breathing fishes has evolved 70 times, which has produced a large variety of air breathing organs. So some of them can use their skin, swim bladder, their mouth, their intestines, their stomach, all sorts of variety of organs. So we talked about the electric eel already, and these guys actually use a vascularized mouth. So basically their mouth has a whole bunch of holes in it that are perfused by blood vessels. So they take a gulp of air, take a gulp of air and they hold it in their mouth, and the oxygen from the air diffuses into the blood vessels that are in their mouth. So it's almost like a kind of a lung in your mouth. However, lungfish actually do have a lung, hence their name. And their lungs are very similar to our lungs. And so you can see that lung structure there. So again, just like the electric eel, comes up, takes a breath, and then it can release it. So the other three fish that I've provided some information on, mudskippers, snakehead, and betta fish, use a different structure called the suprabranchial chamber, or the labyrinth organ. It's basically a bony structure inside the head that has richly perfused with blood vessels, and they take in air through their mouth and send it to the labyrinth organ, where oxygen diffuses from the air into the blood. So oxygen uptake occurs at the air-breathing organ. You send it to the tissues, but the CO2 is released at the gills. So this is a bit of a problem for air-breathing fish. They take advantage of the ample air, or the ample oxygen in the air, but they're still stuck to releasing CO2 in the water. Now, they do this because CO2 is incredibly more soluble in water. So it's about 40 times more soluble in water than air, which makes it a lot easier to excrete it into the water. But if you're a mudskipper, you're not in water, so you can't really release it. So that's a bit of a problem for these guys. Or if you live in places like the swamps of Mississippi or in Brazil, where some of these environments just have naturally high levels of CO2, so they're incredibly high. So normally air has about 0.04% CO2. Some of these environments can get up to 6, 7, 8% CO2. Which basically means that, so the excreting CO2 is not easy for these fish, but they can't ventilate your gills, they can't excrete CO2, and if you live in an environment where there's high CO2, CO2 will move from the water to the fish. And these ultimately mean that CO2 levels increase in the animal. Now, just to provide some background for that, I'm sure everybody's heard of like global warming and climate change, and all that has to do with CO2. So we know that atmospheric CO2 is increasing. This also means that water CO2 in the ocean and other water bodies is increasing. Now what this does is it reduces the pH of water. So CO2 is an acid. And so the more acid you add, the lower the pH will be. So if you increase the water CO2 in an environment where there's a fish, you're going to acidify the blood pH. So here we have water CO2, and then we have blood pH. So we have pH of 8 and a pH of 6.8. So basically more acidic on the right-hand side, less acidic on the left-hand side. With increased CO2, we're acidifying the blood. Now, for us, humans, we can only tolerate relatively low levels of CO2. So here, we have CO2 in percentage on this axis, and the first bar shows the max short-term exposure. Now, I took this from the figure from the WorkSafe BC, so Workers' Comp BC, and the recommended maximum exposure to CO2 is only about 2%, a little bit less than 2% over a working period. The lethal level is about 10%. So we're exposed to 10% CO2, leads to, we go unconscious, and it can lead to death pretty quick. However, air-breathing fishes, they're way better than this. So there's these three species I have here, a couple alligator gar, spotted gar, and armored catfish, can easily tolerate over 10% CO2. Longnose gar and Arapaima, over 20%, so over double what would kill us. And then another three species, all found in Brazil, marble swamp eel, South American lungfish, and the electric eel can tolerate at least up to 27%. Now, when I was down in Brazil, we ran into a slight problem. We were bubbling in CO2 to see what their CO2 tension, how tolerant they were, and we got to about 27%, and they were still okay. But our machine stopped reading past that. So like over 1/4 of their air that they're breathing is CO2. And it's like, whoa, we can't measure anymore. So we basically just stopped the experiment. So it's like pretty crazy. I mean, you know, much, much more tolerant than what we'd be long gone. So what this does in most animals is that if you increase the CO2, you acidify the blood. So typically, blood and tissue change in a similar pattern. So you add CO2 to the water that a fish is in, or the air that we're in, it will acidify the blood. Now, when you acidify the blood, this also leads to changes and reductions in brain, muscle, heart, and liver pH. So you also acidify the tissues. This is tends to be a pattern for sharks, most water-breathing fishes, birds, reptiles, mammals. So most animals that we think of follow this pattern. Now this is very bad because when you change the pH, you affect the protein structure and its function. So pretty much everything that happens in our body is dependent on proteins. And if you change the structure of these proteins, you go from like a nice functional protein that's working properly to a non-functional protein that's basically nonsense. By reducing the pH, your body can't function, and it will lead to dysregulation, abnormal function, and possibly death. Now, I'll just provide some perspective on that. It's almost like cooking an egg. So think about a freshly cracked egg. It's hasn't been altered. You just crack it open. This would be an example of a functional protein. But if you add heat and you cook it, you're basically changing the makeup of it. And that's the same idea with pH. You can basically cook an egg in pH. And there's actually a couple of dishes that people use. I think it's fish dish that you can actually cook using like lemon juice. So basically you're adding acid to a food item and you're changing the structure of it. So that's the kind of thing that happens in these animals. So with that in mind, why can air-breathing fishes tolerate these incredibly high levels of CO2 that are incredibly acidic? Well, that's one of the questions from my PhD thesis, so it's a portion of that. And so to address this, I looked at pH, or acid-base regulation, in a variety of air-breathing fishes. So one of the things we did, we went down to Mississippi and Texas. We worked with gar. There's a number of gar species down there. South America, Brazil. So here's a number of our setup. One of the rooms that we had, the lungfish. We have the armored catfish. Anyways, there's a lot of air-breathing fishes down there. I just want to give you an idea of the type of environment that some of these fish live in. So we took a boat through the flooded forest, and this is actually, the water levels are actually about 7 or 8 meters high here. But they're incredibly hypoxic, or low in oxygen, and incredibly high in CO2. And you can see it's all this vegetation on the surface. Now, the lungfish and the eel and many other fish are found in these environments. So this is a pretty normal environment for these fish. And we also did some work in Vietnam. Now in Vietnam, air-breathing fishes are incredibly important for food, and quite often a lot of the markets don't have live fish at the market, and they'll just have them in these trays here. There's probably like a little bit of water to keep them moist, but all these fish are alive, and you can go in the market and you can buy, 3 climbing perch, or I don't know, a snakehead, or one of these knife fish, and they're all alive. They're just sitting there. You can see them kind of breathing. Anyways, you can take home fresh fish. That's really useful in a country that's electricity is kind of intermittent, and it's just it's not really feasible to have all the fancy supermarkets that we have here. So we, example of what we did, so we put these fish in these buckets and we bubbled in CO2. Now I mentioned that the South American lungfish are incredibly CO2 tolerant. So this is our contraption that we used to measure CO2, and the units are different. We measure CO2 in millimeters of mercury, which is commonly used for like blood pressure and stuff. But on this side is 0 CO2, and we went all the way up here to over 200 millimeters of mercury, which is over 27%. When we got to this point, kind of like, I don't really know what to do here. I mean, I guess you can keep bubbling in CO2, but you have no idea how much. So we had to kind of call it a day with that. But we found some really cool stuff when we measured blood and tissue pH. We found that in air-breathing fishes, tissue pH is not affected by blood pH. So in air-breathing fishes, blood pH still falls. So the blood is still acidified during high CO2. But the brain, muscle, heart, and liver, their acid-base balance, their pH does not change. So basically everything is fine. They're happy. Their blood's affected, but all the important stuff is fine. That explains, one of the main reasons that explains why these fish are still moving around, swimming, and not flopped over dead. So that's pretty cool. So this ability to regulate the pH of its tissue allows air-breathing fishes to tolerate severe acid-base disturbances, such as those caused by high CO2. So, but what's the big deal about like being CO2 tolerant, studying these fish? While pH regulation and CO2 tolerance are important for many key evolutionary events, one of the reasons we study these fish is to learn about how vertebrates evolved from life in the water to life on land. So we can learn about the transition from marine environment to freshwater. Regulating your acid-base or pH balance in the ocean is much easier than in freshwater for reasons I won't get into, but because some fishes are able to protect their tissue pH, they can make this transition. They can make way into new habitats. The other cool thing is that because they're able to protect their tissue pH, they're able to utilize marginal habitats where there's less competition for resources. So here we have an environment where there's like high oxygen, low CO2, probably a lot of fish species in here, really hard to get food and stuff. But if you're able to take advantage of habitat that nobody else can, like this over here, you can do really well. And that's because they're able to regulate their pH so good. That's very cool. And changes to pH regulation and CO2 tolerance are adaptation for air breathing. So basically, this is a fancy word for pre-adaptation. So basically, because they have the ability to protect their pH and be really tolerant to CO2, they're able to more likely breathe air. So it's kind of, nothing ever really evolves adaptation for something in the future, but it just happens that these particular traits are very useful for air breathing. So now this fish can take advantage of all this air that we're breathing. And ultimately, these changes allow fish and their ancestors to become independent of water, allowing them to become terrestrial. So we can look at the transition from life in the water to life on land. So things like the mudskipper is kind of a good example. We got fish, like a fish that, it's kind of moving on from land. It's a very nice looking tetrapod thing. So I'm just going to finish up with saying that air-breathing fishes are way cool because they can help us understand the evolution of life from water to land and some of the adaptations required for that monumental evolutionary event. And I just want to acknowledge everybody that's kind of participated in some of these projects and stuff like that. And with that, I'll just take any questions you guys have.